Homeboy. Homeboy. Brothers, there's only one blood, cause it ain't no sense in us trampling on the stones. It's us, down to the bone. Blood is thick, waters were known well, cousins were kept apart, mothers were often memories. Fathers were not favorites on the farm, for he could do some harm, he could wreck the master's scheme, for he, brothers, could dream. Your mama ain't no saint, your daddy died in a shallow stream, but your uncle Dr. King did have a dream.
Homeboy by Sunchi Ali. Welcome to the Qumran Report. May the peace and blessings of the life-giving creative spirit be upon you and upon your family. My name is Melvin Ishmael Johnson, coming at you live from Mara's Media Studio. Our call-in number is 1-323-293-3375. Now, this week on the Qumran Report, our topic is Paul Robeson and the Roby Theater Company. I'm delighted to have with us in the studio the playwright George Corbin for his new play, The Wrong Kind of People, which have a stage reading at the Los Angeles Theater Center this Sunday, April the 15th, 2018 at 3 o'clock p.m. The Los Angeles Theater Center is located at 514 South Spring Street, downtown Los Angeles, 90013. For ticket information, call 213-489-7402. Now, this past Monday, April the 9th, 2018, was the birthday of Paul Robeson. I would like to play a 1-minute clip from Paul Robeson talking about being proud to be an American and why.
I am an American, born there. My father slaved there. Upon the backs of my people was developed the primary wealth of America. The primary wealth. You have to have accumulated wealth to start, to build. You did it another way here in Australia. You had to build your accumulated wealth too. You just came and took it. You know what I mean? And that's what they did in most of the countries. That's what you Europeans did. You just took it. We got to catch up with you a little bit. So in America, there's a lot of America that belongs to me yet. You understand? But just like a Scottish American is proud of being from Scotland, I'm proud for being African. Now, in our school books, they tried to tell me that all Africans were savages till I got to London and found most of the Africans I knew were going to Oxford and Cambridge and doing very well and learned their culture. And even once somebody had the temerity after one had conquered the Chinese people and imposed upon them the opium trade and everything else to suggest that they were a backward people, just the people who had been civilized so long over the rest of you folks didn't make any sense at all. So somewhere it was wonderful to find about the colored peoples of the world that they were very advanced. So I would say today that I'm an American who is infinitely prouder to be of African descent, no question about it. No question about it. I'm an Afro-American, and I don't use the word American ever loosely again.
Leroy Robeson, born April the 9th, 1898. He died January the 23rd, 1976. He was an American bass, baritone, concert artist, and stage and film actor who became famous both for his cultural accomplishment and for his political activism. He was educated at Rutgers College and Columbia University. He was also a star athlete in his youth. Paul Robeson was a perfect example of the student athlete. He was active in the civil rights movement and other social justice campaigns. His sympathy for the Soviet Union and his criticism of the United States government and his foreign policy caused him to be blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And I always say that Paul Robeson was a combination of Malcolm X and Dr. King before we had Malcolm X and Dr. King. And we want to get into that. I think I have Ben Guillory on the line. Okay, we don't have Ben on the line yet. So let's get in here and talk to George for a while. I'm delighted to have us in the studio, George Corbin. He's going to talk about his new play, The Wrong Kind of People, which will be performed this Sunday, April the 15th, 2018, at 3 o'clock p.m. at the Los Angeles Theater Center, 514 South Spring Street, downtown Los Angeles. George, welcome to the Qumran Report.
Glad to be here.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get into our discussion of the play in depth and all that kind of stuff, I want to get some of your thoughts on Paul Robeson, since he was one of your fraternity brothers. Can you talk about the influence?
Yes, I take great pride, along with the rest of our fraternity, in having Brother Robeson a member of the first predominantly black fraternity, along with W.E.B. Du Bois. Mm-hmm. Along with Jesse Owens, along with Thurgood Marshall. Mm-hmm. As you can see, a common thread.
Dr. King.
And most of all, Dr. King, the most recent, social justice. When it comes to Paul Robeson, one of the major takeaways for me from his life was his worldview. Mm-hmm. He saw himself, while he just mentioned, he loved America and he was an American, but at the same time he saw himself as a person of the world. And wherever people were being oppressed, and that for him meant this duality of class and race. He wrestled with this during his lifetime, which was the more impactful for our country. At first he thought, I think, if I remember from my reading, he thought it was class. But then he became more convinced race was a more critical issue to move our country forward. So his ability to identify with coal miners in Wales, Scotland, and their challenge, Russia, he did stumble along the way. He was not a perfect individual, but in terms of impact and a man of courage and conviction and speaking truth to power, which got him in trouble, as you mentioned, mm-hmm. with the House of Un-American Activities. One of the interesting factors many people either don't know or don't remember, Paul Robeson had, this is during the Korean War build-up and the Korean War, said, wait a minute, we supply our Negro men to fight in every single war America has had, and they return home to a segregated country. Mm-hmm. And maybe we won't go to war this time. Mm-hmm. We won't provide you with black troops until mm-hmm. there's some assurance. This panicked the powers that be. So everything kind of ground to a halt in a sense. They called Jackie Robinson mm-hmm. and put him on the spot. They wanted Jackie Robinson to diss him, basically, mm-hmm. To reassure the white administration and the powers that be that was okay. Well, Jackie tried to walk on this narrow path. One hand, what he said basically was, Paul Robeson, he can be a little silly at times, silly man, but he has the right to speak. That was enough. Paul Robeson, from what I understand in my reading and research, never called Jackie Robinson on that. He could have, but he didn't.
Let me, I want to come back. We get into the discussion, but I think we got Ben Guillory on the line.
Yes, sir. Hello. How are you, Mel?
Hey, Ben, how are you doing? So Ben Guillory, he's the artistic director and the co-founder of the Roby Theater Company. So Ben, welcome to the Qumran Report.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you this, Ben. What is the meaning of Paul Robeson to you?
Well, he represented so much, but at the end of the day, after everything was said and done, he was a humanitarian. And he looked at the world as a world he had hoped would be a brotherhood. And the Roby Theater Company and myself and Danny and I have had many talks about this, should represent that. Should represent that spirit that was about the spirit of brotherhood in the world and about doing the right thing. So Paul represents, first he was an athlete, a student, and then an athlete, then an attorney, then an artist, then an activist, and finally a humanitarian that simply stood up and spoke the truth. And for that reason, I find him very admirable, very courageous in a really true sense of the word, because we're talking about a guy who was living what some people call a very fat life in the 30s and 40s and put everything material on the line to stand up for principle, to stand up for righteousness. All he had to do was keep his mouth shut. All he had to do was be quiet and not say anything, as the State Department requested he do. And he said, I cannot stand silent, knowing that he was going to lose all those material things, which was quite a bit. He had acquired by then, being the successful, world-renowned, world-recognized artist and an actor that he was. He put all that on the line and basically lost all of that. But if you talk to him at that time, he said in his book, Here I Stand, and in other quotes, that he felt that he won, because those were just simply things. As we all find out sooner or later, it's things that come and go and can be replaced, but principle and integrity cannot.
Well, let me ask you this, man. One of the amazing things to me is, this Monday was Paul Robeson's birthday. And I often wonder I check the television, the internet, most of the shows and all that kind of stuff. You would think that at least some of the black nationalists or something like that, why do you think Paul Robeson have been forgotten by so many people during this day and age?
Well, part of it is forgotten, but part of it is blacklisted and erased. So there's that part that is important to remember. And, generally speaking, the world, in part, seems to dispense or discard or forget or simply replace one heroic figure with a current heroic figure, especially in these days where we have such an influx of information available to us on a daily basis. It's almost overwhelming. But for Paul, what he went through, again, what he sacrificed in the 50s, and because, we're talking about a guy who was talking about racial injustice before it was popular, before it was the movement. It was a movement, but the movement. He was talking about all these things beforehand, but his kinship with socialism, scientific socialism, alienated him from many. And of course, when the House Un-American Activities Committee called him in front of them and asked him, and grilled him like they grilled so many other people, and he gave them what for right back, they blacklisted him, ruined his career, and many of the movement leaders of the day discarded Paul. Didn't want anything to do with him because they believed what was being said about him, about that he was, quote, a communist. He never was a communist, never was a card-carrying communist. He never copped to that because he wasn't. He was a believer in scientific socialism, just as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois was a believer in socialism, just as Eslanda Cardozo Good, his wife, was a believer in socialism. And at the time, again, well, I know we don't have enough time, Mel, to really go into it in depth, but back then, socialism to many people was a good idea because of the Depression and because of the state of poor people in this country. That sounded like a very, very good idea.
And a lot of people, a lot of your scholars in this day and age, when they talk about Dr. King and they talk about Malcolm X, they point out that the thing that they think that got Malcolm X killed is when he wanted to take the United States to the UN, and the thing that got Dr. King killed was he became an international voice with the Nobel Peace Prize and speaking out against the Vietnam War. But a lot of people don't realize that in 1950, Paul Robeson and William Patterson took a 250-page report to the UN. One read it in Paris and one read it in New York, accusing the United States of America of genocide against the black people, the Negroes at that time, with all of the lynchings and all of that was going on. So that's why I said that because I thought one of the misconceptions about Paul Robeson and Dr. Du Bois is so many people define these individuals with what's happening in the 20s, the Harlem Renaissance and all that, especially Dr. Du Bois. But when you look at these individuals towards the latter part of their life, they had totally moved away from most of the ideas that they had in the 20s, especially Paul Robeson. But let me ask you this, Ben, before we get into the founding of the Roby Theater Company. What do you think is the major meaning and importance of Paul Robeson for this day and age?
Well, to stand up, to stand for integrity, to stand for principle, to stand for honesty, and to be courageous in these stands, because those are not easy, simple postures, especially in this day and age. The way things, especially currently, it's not an easy stance to take because you get a lot of flack. You get a lot of flack. And the more noted one becomes, the more of a target one becomes. And that's where the courage comes in, to stand one's ground when one believes one believes. The more of a target one becomes.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to project a picture of you on the screen. I know we got a picture of you somewhere, but I want to talk about, can you talk, I know you and Danny Glover founded the Roby Theater. Can you talk about some of the intimate details about how did this come about, when you were sitting down, and did you play with a lot of names before you came up with Roby? How did this come about?
No, we didn't play with a lot of names. We didn't have, it's not to say that there aren't other role models and heroic figures. God, we could spend the rest of the day accounting and bringing up all the heroic people of color that have fought the good fight and have had the same integrity and principled stances that Paul had. But what happened was that I didn't know about Paul Robeson in the late 60s. I didn't know. I knew what probably most people knew, which was that he was a singer. He sang that song "Old Man River." Something about he was an actor way back when, because I knew about the Emperor Jones, the film, had seen it, and something about communism. But I didn't know really about him until I became an actor, and I was invited to audition for a play called "Are You Now, or Have You Ever Been?" And that was the question that the HUAC committee asked most of the people they brought to the hearing committee. Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And when we worked on that play, I did a lot of research, of course, to know who Paul was, and started to understand who he was, what he represented, what he had gone through, and how he took a stance. And the more I learned about him, the more I admired him, and the more I thought, well, I'm an actor, certainly, of course, not in the same realm as Paul was, or in the same artistry, because his vocal talents alone could have and did stay him in a career. He was a linguist. We're talking about a guy who spoke and sang in 20 languages. This is the guy who was an attorney before the American Bar Association allowed, quote, Negroes, unquote, into the American bar. He did 14 films before he decided, I'm not doing anymore, because they tell me one thing, that it's going to be like this and have some kind of integrity for blacks in the films, and then the studios would change that. First guy to play Othello on Broadway, 1943, first black man to do Othello on Broadway, still holds the record for the longest running Shakespearean production in the history of Broadway theater, 298 performances. When I started learning all these things and more, I just admired the man. Then I was invited to do a one-person show on Paul Robeson, Philip Hayes Dean's play entitled Paul Robeson, that chronicled his public life from childhood to pretty much the end. And it, of course, Eslanda was involved in that. And I always want to include Eslanda because she was truly a woman behind the man. She managed his career. She introduced him to the theater. She was the first black pathologist in D.C. She was an anthropologist. She was really a woman of true stature and a match for Paul, needless to say. And so when I did all of that work and began to really understand how he could have just been quiet, because this is important. There are a lot of folks who have opportunities to speak out, and for whatever reason, they choose not to. And then there are people who choose to speak out, and they risk much, and they know that they risk much. All that is deemed successful in this society, material success, money, prestige, the admiration of many. They put all of this at risk for principle.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this is the kind of thing I wanted to work towards and stand for. And Danny is the same. You can look at Danny's career and see that very clearly. You know, it's comparable in many ways to Paul's career.
Mm-hmm. Danny Glover, yeah.
Yes, Danny Glover, the co-founder of the Roby Theater Company. So we had a lot of conversations about this. But Paul was always first.
Mm-hmm. George, want to ask you a quick question.
I'm not quite sure. How did you and Danny Glover connect originally to create the Roby Theater Company?
Man, that's a good question, George. You know, we both grew up in San Francisco, and we knew each other before we were actors. You know, we'd see each other. I mean, I'm talking high school. And we'd see each other around town and nod and be at parties and the whole social scene that young people go to, and, you know, we all. But when we both became actors, and this was in our 20s, I trained at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. I spent 5 seasons there, 3 seasons in their training company, and then a couple of seasons as an actor in the ensemble, the American Conservatory Ensemble Theater Company, as a teacher and as an actor with the company. Danny was part of the Black Actors Workshop there, and this was, I at one point, I directed the Black Actors Workshop, and we refocused and reignited our well, not reignited, but we became much more friends because we had so much more in common. And one summer, we were looking for something to do, and we came across an Athol Fugard play called The Blood Knot, a 2-person play, and we said, let's do this. And so we rehearsed it. We did that at the American Conservatory Theater in their experimental workshop, and we took it on tour around the Bay Area to, you know, everything from high schools to jails. And, of course, we would have many, many conversations about, one, the work itself. How could we build a career? How could we fashion a career? And 2, the kind of work that was available to a couple of young black actors. Now, remember, this is in the mid-'70s, late 70s, that all this is happening. This is before August Wilson, even. And the only play that, let's say, the American Conservatory Theater would entertain doing would be A Raisin in the Sun. And they wouldn't really seriously entertain doing that because there's 9 actors of color in the play. And they have a standing company of about 40 actors. And if they hire 9 actors, black actors, to do A Raisin in the Sun, their question was, well, what do we do with these black actors after A Raisin in the Sun? Because colorblind casting was not in vogue then. This was not politically correct then. Colorblind casting was not something that the culture of theater was even taken seriously at the time. So they couldn't see other black actors doing anything other than black parts as written. So they weren't going to do that play. So the conversation continually went on, and we were looking for work. We were looking for a certain kind of work to do, something that had more to it than being the traditional butler or the slave that was a norm back then in Eurocentric theater. This is how that was, we were seen for the most part, and where we were cast in the most part. And we wanted to do something else. We knew there was other work out there, so we both went to work looking for it. And we said, at one of those coffee sessions of many that we had, well, we're going to start our own theater and figure out how to do a certain kind of work. And that's where it came from, George. Those kinds of conversations and those real needs.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this, Ben. What do you think? I got about 2 or 3 more questions. What do you think is the status of black theater out here in Los Angeles now, and what do you think could make it better?
Well, I always preface that question. I get asked that question every so often, and one has to remember that really, truly, I believe that no one comes to Los Angeles to build a career in theater. They come to build careers in film and television. They may love theater. They may have been weaned in theater, trained in theater. They may have a true passion for that kind of work. But when they come to Los Angeles, artists come here to build careers in television and film. 1, because they want to do that kind of work. 2, because they can make a living at it. It's very difficult to make a living in theater. Mm-hmm. Extremely difficult to make a living in theater. It's feast and famine. When it's good, it's good. When there are last count I heard, over 200 theaters in town.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a dozen, maybe a little more, Hispanic theaters, Latin theaters. There's 3 Asian theaters. There is probably 4 or 5 Jewish theaters. There are 3 theaters that I know of that are black theaters that do consistent work. Mm-hmm. Consistent work. There's a couple of theaters. The Griot Theater has been around for about 4 or 5 years now. They do things over in the Valley. Wonderful work they do. Small theater company, Black Box. Mm-hmm. And the Town Street Theater. And then, of course, the Ebony Ensemble. Mm-hmm. And Roby and Town Street are black boxes. We work in 99-seat arenas. And the Ebony Ensemble has a 400-seat theater, the Nate Holden Theater across town. They do a production probably almost about kind of sort of every other year for all the obvious reasons. They're in a Lord House, an Equity House, a Union House, which means their budgets are larger, which means this is a very, again, filling 400 seats at somewhere around anywhere below and above $50 tickets for 20 performances, 30 performances, tough one, especially if one does not have a subscription audience, which is fewer and fewer these days. To have a subscription audience in place, or to have a constituency that regularly comes to the theater.
But let me ask you this, Ben, because I think we talked about it in the past. The United States used to have a national theater company called the Federal Theater Project. They had that for about 6 years until they felt there was too many communists in it. They was really talking about Paul Robeson because he was
you told me that the other day.
Yeah, he was the most high profile at that time. But after they destroyed the Federal Theater Project, there were a number of proposals that have been on the table by W.B. Du Bois, Herbert Harrison, Theos Lewis, Anita Bush, a few of the others about putting together a national black theater company. And their theory was that it should be based upon 4 things. It should be by us, near us, about us, and for us. But there was a conflict between the actors and the playwright on whether this should be a national black playwrights theater or whether it should be based upon the black actors. And most of the actors went their way, and we've never been able to have it. And I hear the argument all the time about the influx of European black actors that come from England and other spots like that, and we see them getting all of the choice role, and they are well trained. Is there a great need to look at that again for a national black theater company, especially with the need to reestablish all of the infrastructures in these toe-up black communities, even out here, where we at now? Is there a need for that?
I think there's a need for it.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely think there's a need for a specific black theater country, because our culture and the reason the Roby Theater Company exists also beyond the obvious reasons that I think I've mentioned some of them, is that the stories, our culture, what we have to offer, the talent, the artistry, the ephemeral quality that we carry in our meat, in our memory, that goes back as far as time goes back. It's in us. Some people don't believe these kinds of things. I do. I think we carry a cultural memory, even though perhaps we haven't experienced it firsthand, because I'm talking about 200 years ago. I'm talking about 500 years ago. The things that happened to us and to those that we love and surround us, family, friends, it's in us. And we have not had the same opportunities to develop that culture as Eurocentric theater here in this country has had that opportunity, because the resources hadn't been made available to us. They're more available to us now. Still, we haven't had, again, one of the reasons the Roby Theater Company exists is because of that need. We need to train, we need to be aware of certain principles, certain nuts and bolts of dramatizing, of storytelling. We need to cultivate and build our own map that is a cultural map that may not be the same structure as Eurocentric theater. There's nothing, again, one has to, I just want to be clear, Mel. I like I said, I spent 5 seasons at a white theater company in San Francisco. They did wonderful work. I learned a lot there. I didn't know a lot, so it was easy to learn a lot. There was a lot of things I didn't know about, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about principle. I learned a lot about storytelling. It was all under a Eurocentric mask, which is legitimate and wonderful, and storytelling that is inspiring.
Well, okay. Well, let's
still need. It should be said now. We, as a people, as a culture, and every culture needs their own house to develop their own way of doing things, because there is value in that.
Without a doubt. Let's go. Before I let you go, let's talk a little about the wrong kind of people, because I think you was involved with one of the first readings going way back, and I would like to get your thoughts on producing this and where you see it heading. Have you seen any changes from? I think George showed me a video one time where you guys was doing a reading in the backyard at some kind of. I think it was the first. I saw Vanji and a few.
That
of
was
others.
Sammy.
That was
Sammy. Ben remembers the first table read at the end of our workshop several years ago. So,
boy, that was several years ago, wasn't it, George? Boy,
yes, it goes.
Time passes.
Certainly
But yeah,
does.
the answer to that question though is I've seen some. Well, if we talk about the wrong kind of people, we got to talk about George.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because it's George. You know, this is his artistry, and only part of it. And at the risk of embarrassing George by just tooting his horn, because he doesn't toot his horn, but by tooting his horn, George, I've known George, what is it, 6, 7, 8 years now? I don't even remember. It's been a long time. We've known each other a long time.
Years. Yep.
And George has been a part of the theater community here in Los Angeles. He's been a part of the Roby theater community here and has made obvious contributions as a playwright and obvious contributions as a producer to the theater community here in Los Angeles. And The Wrong Kind of People is simply another and the current piece of work that he's working on and continues to work on. The last, or the first rehearsal of this go-around reading, he handed me a scene that clarified and was a scene that was a work in progress that probably will be included in this reading. So, again, this is, when we talk about the work, it's always a work in progress, the work that we do. Even if the play is produced, it's still a work in progress because, well, I don't go into all of that part, but it's progressive work.
Mm-hmm.
It's always progressive work. And writers, artists like George are really important contributors to all of that.
And we're looking forward to Sunday, this coming Sunday at 3 o'clock, over to the Los Angeles Theater Center, the reading of this great play. Mm-hmm. It's a different kind of play. I like it. I kind of I want to see where it's going to go when it's staged fully. Because at first, when I first read this play, I thought it was going to be a play without any scene breaks, something like in real time, and I thought that would have been very interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay, Ben, we've taken up enough of your time. So,
it's a pleasure.
Thank you,
Mel. Always a pleasure. Mm-hmm. Please, yes, I hope the audience comes. We're at 514 South Spring Street, 3 o'clock Sunday, The Wrong Kind of People. And, you know, it should be mentioned that the play has so much humor in it, and at the same time has a social consciousness, which is not an easy mix. And it's a tribute to George's talent that he's made it work. He's made it work, you know.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ben Guillory, artistic director, one of the co-founders of the Roby Theater Company.
Appreciate it, Mel.
Thanks,
Take care, George. Is Sammy there?
Sammy is supposed to call in later on.
Okay. Mm-hmm. My best to Sammy, who's directing all of this, who's bringing it home. Okay. Take care, fellas.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye.
Mm-hmm. Okay, George, let's talk about the wrong kind of people. Where what's the essence of, you know, the first time, as I mentioned earlier, that I started reading this play, and I was reading, I was saying, when is the act going to end? And then when I got to like page 30 something, it was still rolling, and I was saying to myself, you know, this is very interesting. To be able to write a play from the beginning to the end in real time without any scene break, something that I thought about for the future. But can you talk about where you see it at the time that I saw the video in the backyard and where we at now with it?
Well, first of all, let me tell you where this whole idea came from. Actually, I set out to write a serious play, not a comedic, zany play, which I hope you will experience on Sunday. I was doing research on the racial covenant, and the racial covenant, for those of you who don't know it, by 1930 and 1940, 80% of the houses in Los Angeles had a racial covenant which said, in essence, you cannot sell this house to an African American or an Asian American or sometimes other minority groups. And the key to this was it remained with the house. No matter who sold it or purchased it, they could not change that. And by the way, it wasn't until 1947 that the Supreme Court overturned this. And I wanted to explore this in Los Angeles. And I wanted the idea of a young black attorney to find his courage in pursuing this topic and challenging a white legal authority. In this case, Judge Purdy it ended up being. Now, so that was the central theme. Then I had to locate the actual play, the setting. And I remember my father, who worked part-time in a hotel in New York during the early part of World War II, he would say it was incredible what went on in a hotel. He said some of the brothers, he didn't use that word, would take whole turkeys out the back windows, back doors, all sorts of nefarious things went on in the hotel. So I got that. Let's locate a hotel. And then the concept of a room that was designed to discourage minority guests from staying at a posh hotel on Wilshire Boulevard. And so that came together. And then originally I wrote the play in set scenes, distinct scenes. But I ended up, because the characters took over, which is not that unusual for any playwright. Sometimes they take over your play. You didn't. In this case, the comedic impact of the judge, who has he is a little racist. He's over the top, and he becomes a screen on which to project issues.
How would you style this? What you call it, a melodrama, slapstick, in between?
I would say it's more of a zany type. The old movie, The Man Who Came to Dinner, that kind of fast-paced, zany impact. The planets, revolving around the sun. In my play, the central character is Theo, but revolving around Theo are these other satellite characters.
Well, let me ask you this. As a writer, playwright myself, I always say that when a playwright creates worlds, and they when you create something, it's just like a little baby being born, and you want to give that baby a name, so when, because I try to name it when it first come into existence, or it's just like a mother naming their little baby. Now, this particular piece, the thing, it don't confuse me, it amazes me when I see three names floating. The window man, the wrong kind of people, and what's that other word?
Malcolm Populus, which is the
Latin legal
for the wrong
term.
kind of.
Yeah.
By the way, the term, why I named the play originally Wrong Kind of People, and doing the research on the racial covenant, that's how they
Wrong
they
kind of people
they don't
for the
wrong
name.
kind of people. Well, you don't want the wrong kind of people.
Was it the racial covenant? Was it the opposite side of that from a legal point of view? In other words, black people that had houses and stuff, could they sell to anybody, or they had to?
First of all, from my research, I'm sure there are people out listening who know a lot more than I do. The racial covenant, again, I want to be clear, was homes that were originally either built or purchased, which included this covenant, which says this will remain with the home. You as a homeowner cannot change it in the process of selling it. So if a African American were to come and offer you $1 million for your house, you could not sell it. And legally, at that time, that remained the case. So you had many African Americans who had moved in the 30s and the 40s in the Great Migration, some of whom, as you may know, it's really Los Angeles that had the largest community of African Americans versus San Francisco, and say, this is where the need to move in the middle class and so forth. At the same time, people have always heard about redlining. Redlining came about, and if you go online, you can see the actual map for Los Angeles. FDR and coming out of the Depression to help average people, average white people, and secondarily blacks, for home ownership, established a scale based on risk of payment and so forth, so you could get a low-cost loan. They took Los Angeles and they color-coded the neighborhood. You'll see a large swath, almost a square, which was all red. That was us, African American. So it was based on not just income level, but wrong kind of people, and thus are
they were still dealing with the whole theory of separate but equal that had come down in 1898 Plessy versus Ferguson thing. It didn't break that down until Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. But let me ask you this. What is your process for writing plays?
Okay. My process, which has evolved, but basically I'm curious and interested in either obscure parts of black history that the vast majority of people don't know about. And I'm thinking, how can I bring that to the fore in an interesting way and tell a story that today's audience, black audience primarily, would find interesting and entertaining. So the play I'm working on and the one scene which you're going to use is an example of that. The other process, I write an outline, like a one-page. Can I tell the whole story, beginning, midpoint, and an end? Not just. I have pages of stories I've written. They sound great, and I grind to a halt. I've got to be able to envision a complete story
From the
and
beginning.
some sort of arc, and the characters changing, how they get different at the end.
Let me ask you this. You've seen the movie Black Panther, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think the movie Black Panther had such a powerful effect on especially the African American young community?
Well, my personal take on this, and everybody, I go to tons of movies, so I'm a real movie fan. I think the world created by the screenwriter was unusually rich and layered and textured. The characters were three-dimensional, every single one of them. And the emphasis on relationships, like the sister, who was the science a driver for their unique country. And I think there was evidence of love. I think a major part of it was also that there were strong black women, and they didn't look like the Barbies. They were uniquely beautiful, strong-willed, and powerful in the various aspects. The other part that made it interesting, I think, for many, maybe younger black Americans, was the take of maybe black Americans, historically, it's nothing new, not really having a good, positive image of Africa and Africans, of course. Africa you can put 8 of the largest countries in the world and pack it in Africa, so we have to be very careful when we use Africa. But this unique country didn't necessarily have a totally clear picture of blacks in the U.S. as well. So this I found that part fascinating.
Well, what I found interesting, I think we had this conversation because we could do a whole show on this. I found it interesting with the partial history of going back to Oakland, where the modern, and I call them the modern Black Panther, because the original Black Panther, I think we had this discussion, is mentioned in the Talmud, the traditional Jewish scripture, and that is what they refer to the Messiah Jesus as the Black Panther, which I found interesting. But anyway, that we could do a whole show on that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there have been 1,000 shows done on it. The other final point would be with that reference to the middle passage and slipping.
So I thought it was powerful.
I thought that was particularly powerful and may have triggered interest in young black Americans to open a book or go online and find out a little more about our history.
Yeah. Okay, George, we're winding down. Any final comments before we?
Well, I obviously I would like for you to come out and see my latest effort, and I think you won't be disappointed. I do need your help because we will have a brief feedback session afterwards. Reading is principally for the playwright to get feedback to see whether there are aspects that need to be worked on, improved, tweaked.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's this Sunday. The Wrong Kind of People at the Los Angeles Theater Center, George Corbin's new play, directed by Sammy Wayne, produced by Ben Guillory and the Roby Theater Company. It's at 3:00 p.m. That's at the Los Angeles Theater Center, which is located at 514 South Spring Street, downtown Los Angeles. For ticket information, you can call 213-489-7402. So thank you, George. A special thanks to my in-studio guest, George Corbin, the playwright George Corbin, on the line with Ben Guillory, the artistic director and the co-founder of the Roby Theater Company. Now, please listen to past shows of the Qumran Report by Googling in Qumran Report. Thank you for tuning in to the Qumran Report. From your host, Melvin Ishmael Johnson, may the peace and blessings of the life-giving creative spirit be upon you and upon your family. I leave you with Homeboy by Sunji Ali.
Homeboy. Homeboy. Brothers, there's only one blood, cause it ain't no sense in us trampling on the stones. It's us, down to the bone. Blood is thick, waters were known well, cousins were kept apart, mothers were often memories. Fathers were not favorites on the farm, for he could do some harm, he could wreck the master scheme, for he, brothers, could dream. Your mama ain't no saint, your daddy died in a shallow stream, but your uncle Dr. King did have a dream, my brother. And what is your real excuse? Why can't you study your lessons and stay in school? Why can't you study your lessons and stay in school? Free love and sex ain't nothing but a game. Don't never last, try hope. Take a chance on love, register to vote. Money ain't everything, but you could buy her a ring. Listen to little blackbird sing. Buy you a record of a yardbird with wings. Get into the swing of things, homeboy. Buy some tenderness for a change. Home is where your history is, and it's not too late. Your uncle Dr. King wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. Birmingham was yesterday. The mad dogs came to call on your mother's mother and sister. Your granddad had the blackened boots. You know what I'm saying? Cause it ain't but one blood. It's called fighting for freedom. Now, homeboy, love, homeboy, fight for home.